The instrument panel rattled as Flight Lieutenant Ray Holmes pushed his Hawker Hurricane through 15,000 feet, the Merlin engine screaming its familiar growl over the Thames estuary. It was 15th of September 1940, what historians would later call Battle of Britain Day, and the sky above London resembled a grotesque fireworks display of tracer rounds, oil smoke, and burning aircraft. Holmes had already emptied both ammunition boxes into a Messerschmitt Bf 110, watching it spiral away trailing glycol coolant. Standard procedure dictated an immediate return to base for rearming, but standard procedure assumed the enemy would cooperate. They didn't. Ahead and slightly above, a Dornier Du 17 bomber. The Luftwaffe crews called them flying pencils for their slender fuselages, maintained steady course towards central London. Holmes could see the aircraft's cruciform tail clearly, the black crosses stark against camouflage paint. He knew what sat in that bomber's belly. 1,000 kilograms of high explosive destined for the London docks, or perhaps Buckingham Palace, or any of a dozen critical targets that intelligence suggested Hermann Goering had marked for destruction that afternoon. The Dornier's pilot held formation discipline, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that a British fighter had closed to 400 yards behind him. Holmes pressed both gun buttons in a futile gesture. The Browning machine guns offered only hollow clicks. Empty. Completely empty. Not a single round remained of the 2,060 rounds he'd lifted off with from North Weald Aerodrome 40 minutes earlier. The mathematics of the situation assembled themselves with cruel clarity in his mind. The Dornier cruised at roughly 180 miles per hour. At current trajectory, it would cross into London's urban sprawl in approximately 4 minutes. Holmes scanned the sky for other fighters, any other fighters, but the nearest Hurricane wheeled 2 miles distant, engaged with its own target. No one else would intercept this bomber in time. Fighter command doctrine was explicit about such scenarios. Withdraw, return to base, rearm, and return to the fight. Losing experienced pilots to pointless heroics served no strategic purpose, and after 3 months of continuous combat, the RAF possessed fewer than 700 fighter pilots to defend the entire nation. Every squadron commander had watched friends die. Every pilot understood the arithmetic. Britain couldn't afford to trade trained men for empty gestures, yet Holmes didn't turn away. He throttled forward, closing the gap to 200 yards, and his mind began calculating angles that weren't in any training manual. The Dornier possessed defensive armament. A dorsal gunner would certainly open fire if Holmes approached much closer. But without ammunition, getting closer was his only option. The bomber's crew had families in Hamburg or Munich who wanted them home. Holmes had a wife in Croydon who wanted the same. Someone was going to lose this exchange. Below, London sprawled in late afternoon sunlight. 7 million people. The docks, the hospitals, the underground stations packed with sheltering civilians. Holmes had flown over the East End the previous week and seen entire streets reduced to rubble craters, rows of houses simply gone, replaced by smoke and emergency crews digging for survivors. The newspapers called them incidents to maintain morale, but pilots saw the truth from above. Each bomber that reached the city centre delivered death measured in tons. The Dornier held course, steady and confident. Its pilot probably assumed the Hurricane had exhausted ammunition and would break away. A reasonable assumption, a logical assumption. Holmes's hand settled on the throttle, and he made a decision that abandoned both reason and logic. If bullets couldn't stop this bomber, perhaps 3,000 kilograms of Hurricane could. He pushed the throttle to combat emergency power and aimed for the Dornier's tail. Ray Holmes wasn't a reckless man. The 25-year-old Liverpudlian had joined 504 Squadron, as a sergeant pilot in 1938, back when the RAF still flew biplanes and most officers assumed the next war would resemble the last one. He'd accumulated over 600 flying hours before the first Luftwaffe raid crossed the Channel, more experienced than half the replacement pilots arriving weekly at fighter command squadrons. His logbook recorded a methodical pilot, cautious on approaches, disciplined in formation, the sort who checked his parachute straps twice, the sort who came home, which made what happened next even more remarkable. Holmes closed to within 50 yards of the Dornier's tail, close enough to see the German rear gunner swiveling his MG-15 machine gun. The geometry required precision, too shallow an angle and he'd bounce off harmlessly, too steep and both aircraft would disintegrate. He needed to strike with enough force to cripple the bomber's control surfaces whilst preserving some chance, however slim, of his own survival. The Hurricane's thick wings could absorb tremendous punishment. The Dornier's tail assembly couldn't. At 20 yards, the German gunner opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked past Holmes's canopy, one punching through the windscreen and exiting through the roof fabric behind his head. He didn't flinch. He'd already committed. The Hurricane's propeller, spinning at 2,600 revolutions per minute, became a circular saw 3 feet in diameter. Holmes aimed it like a surgeon's scalpel at the Dornier's elevator, the horizontal control surface that governed pitch. Impact. The propeller chewed through aluminium and structural tubing with a sound Holmes would later describe as tearing canvas, but louder. His Hurricane shuddered violently, the nose pitching upward as shrapnel peppered the engine cowling. The Dornier's entire tail section twisted, then separated. The bomber's nose dropped immediately into a terminal dive, the pilots inside suddenly controlling a 10-ton glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. Holmes fought his own controls as the Hurricane began an inverted spin, bits of German aircraft embedded in his propeller creating catastrophic imbalance. The Merlin engine seized, oil pressure dropped to 0. Holmes was now gliding, falling, really, over central London with a fighter that handled like a shopping trolley. At 8,000 feet, he unstrapped and rolled the aircraft inverted, dropping clear. His parachute deployed at 5,000 feet. He watched his Hurricane impact near Victoria Station, whilst the Dornier smashed through the roof of Victoria Railway Station itself, the bombs mercifully failing to detonate. Holmes landed in a Chelsea rubbish bin. The incident report filed by Wing Commander Douglas Bader, Holmes's immediate superior, made fascinating reading. Bader, himself notorious for aggressive tactics, described the ramming as effective use of aircraft as weapon when ammunition exhausted. Not reckless, not suicidal, effective. The report landed on Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's desk at 11 Group headquarters within hours. Park, who commanded all RAF fighters defending London, had spent 3 months watching German bombers pound his city whilst his outnumbered squadrons bled experienced pilots. The official RAF position condemned ramming as wasteful. Park read Holmes's report 3 times. Then he made a telephone call to each of his squadron commanders. The conversations weren't recorded in official minutes, but squadron diaries and personal letters reveal their substance. Park didn't issue orders, he presented scenarios. If a pilot exhausts ammunition with a bomber approaching a critical target, and no other fighters can intercept, he left the implications unspoken. Squadron leaders understood. The choice belonged to individual pilots, but fighter command would no longer court-martial survivors who made Holmes's choice. Within a week, word spread through every dispersal hut from Kent to Northumberland. The mad bastard who rammed a Dornier over London hadn't just survived. Command had called it effective tactics. The reason became evident when examining Fighter Command's casualty ledgers. Between 8th of August and 18th of September 1940, The RAF had lost 295 pilots killed or missing, with another 171 wounded seriously enough to remove them from combat duty. Training schools produced replacements at roughly 280 pilots per month, adequate in peacetime, catastrophic during the Battle of Britain's peak intensity. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command from Bentley Priory, faced arithmetic that permitted no optimistic interpretation. At current attrition rates, he'd run out of experienced pilots by November. The Luftwaffe knew this, so did Winston Churchill. The strategic mathematics grew darker when considering what those pilots defended. Intelligence estimates suggested that Reichsmarshal Goering had assembled 2,800 aircraft across French and Belgian airfields, bombers, fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, all pointed at Britain's southern coast. Against this armada, Dowding fielded roughly 650 serviceable fighters on any given day, spread across 46 squadrons. The Germans could lose 3 aircraft for every British fighter and still achieve aerial superiority. They were attempting precisely that exchange rate. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's invasion plan, waited in Channel ports. Aerial reconnaissance photographed 1,900 barges assembled between Rotterdam and Le Havre, enough to transport 260,000 troops in the first wave. The Royal Navy would slaughter those barges if they attempted a crossing, but only if the Luftwaffe didn't control the skies. Naval vessels couldn't operate under sustained aerial attack, as the Norwegian campaign had demonstrated brutally in April. Everything depended on Fighter Command maintaining air superiority over the Channel and southern England. Everything. Which made every German bomber that reached London or Coventry or Southampton a tactical defeat. Each successful raid killed civilians, certainly, but more critically it demonstrated to German planners that Britain's air defences contained gaps. That invasion remained feasible, that Britain could be bombed into submission. Churchill's rhetoric about fighting on beaches and landing grounds meant nothing if the RAF couldn't prevent bombs falling on those very beaches and grounds. Dowding understood a grim calculation that peacetime military doctrine never addressed. A Hurricane cost $6,000 to manufacture, roughly 14 months' salary for a skilled factory worker. Training a replacement pilot cost approximately $10,000 and required 6 months minimum, often longer to develop combat proficiency. A Dornier Do-17 bomber cost the Germans roughly 250,000 Reichsmarks and carried a crew of 4 men, each representing months of specialized training. But that bomber could deliver 1,000 kilograms of high explosive onto a factory producing Hurricane parts, or a power station supplying electricity to aircraft manufacturers, or a residential neighborhood whose continued destruction might break civilian morale. The exchange rate wasn't fighter versus bomber, it was potential future production versus immediate threat elimination. Park's 11 Group, defending London and the southeast, absorbed the heaviest pressure. His pilots flew 4 or 5 sorties daily, scrambling the moment radar detected incoming raids. They landed, rearmed, refueled, and launched again, often eating cold sandwiches in the cockpit whilst ground crews worked. Fatigue killed as efficiently as bullets. Pilots fell asleep during debriefings. Some crashed on landing because exhaustion delayed reactions by fatal fractions of seconds. Into this grinding war of attrition, Holmes's ramming attack introduced a variable that conventional tactics hadn't considered. If a pilot's ammunition ran dry, an increasingly common occurrence as combats grew longer and more desperate, the pilot himself became a weapon of last resort. Not a suicide weapon necessarily, Holmes had survived, but a weapon nonetheless, one that couldn't be manufactured in factories or trained in schools, a weapon composed entirely of will and calculated desperation. The High Command, faced a choice between condemning such actions as contrary to regulations or acknowledging that regulations written for peacetime scenarios no longer applied when national survival hung on pilot decisions made in seconds at 15,000 feet. The physics of intentional aerial collision defied every principle drilled into pilots during training. Aircraft structures, whether British or German, were fundamentally assemblies of aluminium alloy stretched over tubular frames, engineering marvels designed to withstand aerodynamic loads, not concentrated impact forces. A Hurricane's empty weight approached 2,400 kilograms. A fully loaded Dornier weighed nearly 9,000 kilograms. Newton's laws regarding momentum and energy transfer suggested that any collision between such masses at combined closing speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour would produce mutual destruction. Yet survival remained possible if pilots understood structural weak points and attack vectors. The key lay in asymmetric targeting. A bomber's tail assembly, the empennage in technical parlance, represented its most vulnerable structure. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal elevators were essentially fabric-covered frameworks attached to the fuselage by relatively fragile mounting points. These surfaces controlled yaw and pitch, making them absolutely critical for controlled flight. Sever them, and even an undamaged bomber became uncontrollable. Meanwhile, a Hurricane's wing leading edge incorporated substantial structural ribs designed to handle stress loads during high-speed maneuvers. Those ribs could function as crude cutting tools. Squadron engineers who examined Holmes's Hurricane wreckage noted that his propeller had absorbed the initial impact, the three-blade assembly shattering but dissipating enormous kinetic energy in the process. The propeller essentially acted as a sacrificial buffer, destroying itself whilst protecting the engine, mounting and forward fuselage structure. This observation proved crucial. Pilots attempting ramming attacks learned to aim their propeller disc, that circular area swept by spinning blades, at bomber tail surfaces. The propeller would disintegrate upon contact, but not before chewing through control surfaces like an industrial grinder meeting cardboard. The approach angle mattered desperately. A head-on ramming attack, whilst dramatic, guaranteed mutual annihilation. Closing speeds in excess of 400 miles per hour meant both aircraft would essentially vaporize upon impact. The kinetic energy released comparable to detonating several hundred kilograms of TNT. No pilot survived such exchanges, making them genuinely suicidal rather than merely desperate. The optimal technique involved overtaking the bomber from slightly below and behind, a pursuit curve that positioned the fighter's propeller against the target's tail, whilst allowing the attacker's forward momentum to carry him through and past the collision point. Physics textbooks would describe this as an oblique elastic collision, though elastic overstated the structural integrity preserved. The fighter essentially performed a high-speed cutting pass, sacrificing propeller and engine but potentially preserving the airframe's basic integrity. If the pilot maintained control through the violent shuddering that followed impact, he might glide to a forced landing or bail out at survivable altitude. Wingtip strikes offered another option, particularly against bombers flying in formation. A Hurricane's wingtip, while sturdy, was expendable. The primary wing spars ran closer to the fuselage, providing structural integrity. A pilot could theoretically sacrifice his outer wing section by striking a bomber's wing or engine nacelle, destabilizing the enemy aircraft whilst retaining enough wing area to maintain controlled flight. Group Captain Peter Townsend documented one such attempt in October 1940, striking a Heinkel. He He-111's port engine with his Spitfire's starboard wingtip. The Heinkel's engine tore away from its mounting, streaming burning oil. Townsend lost 3 feet of wing, but landed successfully at Gravesend. The critical calculation involved energy management. A fighter travelling 50 miles